Okay, so we are about to start in a minute, sir.
Okay, I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, sir. So today we have a privilege to have Professor ILLANPAPPE with us. ILLANPAPPE is a very big name and he does not need an introduction. But nevertheless, we have to introduce him for our audience. So Professor ILLANPAPPE is a professor of history and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at University of Exeter. His research focuses on the modern Middle East and in particular the history of Israel and Palestine. He has also written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and on the power and knowledge in general. About the session. Today's session is about the book of Professor ILLANPAPPE. The title of the book is The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of the Occupied Territories. So I'll be the moderator of the event. My name is Zulfikar Ali Qureshi. I practice law here in Karachi, Pakistan. The event is organized and supported by a group of free thinkers that include students and activists from diverse backgrounds. The group collectively holds the vision for a tolerant, rational, and scientific society. So before just giving the opportunity to speak to Professor ILLANPAPPE, to all of the participants, when they have the question, they just write in the question box at the left hand side and kindly mute yourself so just we can hear Professor ILLANPAPPE in the conversation. And after the presentation of Professor ILLANPAPPE, we will take the question and answer at the end of the session. This session is being live streamed because many of our friends in Kabul do not have good quality internet access. So they will be joining us by YouTube. It's over to you, Professor ILLANPAPPE.
Thank you, Zulfikar, and thank you everyone for attending this session. I'm very glad to be with you today. And I will talk about my book, The Biggest Prison on Earth. Let me give you some background before I will go directly to the main arguments in the book. Most of my work until this book has been written was about the 1948 war in Palestine. The most important book I think I've written about it was called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, in which I described the Israeli actions against the Palestinian people in 1948 as an act of ethnic cleansing that led to the destruction of half of Palestine's villages, the demolition of most of the Palestinian towns, and the expulsion of half of the Palestinian population from the country of Palestine. This book follows chronologically and focuses on the period after 1948, after the catastrophe, which, as many of you know, the Palestinians call the Nakba. And the reason I wanted to look further on was less to question the accepted narrative of the 1967 war. I will refer to that narrative in a minute, but far more in order to understand whether there is a connection between what had been done in 1948 and the Israeli occupation of what became known as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967 and the policies ever since 1967 until today. So in order to put these things in the right historical perspective, I would like to use a term that maybe some of you have already heard about or read about, but it's a relatively new term, although it was once used before, but it kind of made a new appearance in the last 10, 15 years in the scholarship about Israel and Palestine. And this term is settler colonialism. We distinguish between settler colonialism and classical colonialism, whereas classical colonialism is when an empire sends its own people to colonize someone else's land, build colonies, exploiting the colonies for its own purposes. And when the empire falls or disintegrates, then the colonialists go back home because they have a mother country and they have a place to go back to. As happened in the subcontinent that includes India and Pakistan. In your part of the world, you know exactly what colonialism, classical colonialism means. Settler colonialism is a bit different. It is the movement of people who are themselves persecuted in Europe for whatever reason, religious reasons, economic reasons, or cultural reasons, and they need to find a safe place outside of Europe because Europe doesn't want them. So in many ways, they want to recreate the Europe that doesn't want them. And they look for a new place to build their home and later their homeland. Now, in most cases, they choose places which were already inhabited by native indigenous people. And the late scholar Patrick Wolf said that when refugees from Europe, and most of these settlers are refugees, come to a place where someone else lives, unfortunately, they are motivated by what he called the logic of the elimination of the native. In other words, in the eyes of the settlers or these refugees from Europe who could not go back to Europe, in order to build a new home for themselves, the most important obstacle in front of them is the fact that someone else already lives in the place that they are coveting, that they wish to build a new homeland. Now, the elimination of the natives sometimes took the form of genocide, as happened in North America and in Australia. But sometimes the elimination meant removing the indigenous population, as happened in Palestine, or imposing on them a certain political regime like apartheid, as happened in South Africa. So the Zionist movement is actually one of the last settler colonial movements, because the Jews who arrived in Palestine in the late 19th century and declared that Palestine was actually their ancient homeland and that they're going to build a Jewish national home in the land of Palestine, encountered a local Palestinian population that lived there for centuries. And like in any other cases of settler colonialism, were motivated by that logic that Patrick Wolf has detected, the logic of the elimination of the native. Now, in the case of the Zionist movement, the elimination was not genocidal in the sense that they did not intended to eliminate physically the Palestinians, but they were looking for a ways of having as much of historical Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians on it as possible. Of course, when the movement just started in the late 19th century, it was unable to implement any of these visions or ideas because it was small, and after the First World War depended very much on the goodwill of the British Empire, because Britain occupied Palestine in the First World War and remained in power there for the next 30 years, between 1918 to 1948. But while the British were the rulers of Palestine, so to speak, and helping the Zionist movement to build an infrastructure for a future state, the Zionist leaders and intellectuals already discussed very seriously the option of getting rid of the Palestinians in Palestine should they reach that moment in history where they would have the capacity and the right circumstances for implementing their version of the elimination of the native. And that particular historical juncture was in 1948. Because the British decided to leave Palestine. I won't go into the question why, but they left Palestine. Secondly, it was 3 years after the Jewish Holocaust. It was very clear that Europe would be much more forthcoming 3 years after the genocide of the Jews in Europe towards Jewish demands for nationhood. The Arab world that could have supported the Palestinians was in disarray. And the United Nations that was supposed to decide on the future of Palestine was a very small organization with very little experience and did not yet represent most of the nations of Asia and Africa who were still under colonial rule. So they implemented their plan of having as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible in 1948. And within 9 months of that year, they committed the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as I called it in my book in 2007. So in those 9 months in 1948, they demolished 500 Palestinian villages. As I mentioned before, it was half of Palestine's villages altogether. They expelled half of the population and destroyed most of its towns. And on the ruins of these villages, they built Jewish colonies or planted European trees and created recreational forest on these villages. The idea was not just to wipe out the memory of Palestine as an Arab and mostly Muslim country, but also to try and Europeanize the landscape, because they were Europeans and they wanted to feel that they are still part of Europe. But as successful as they were in 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was incomplete. Because they were able to take over only 80% of the country. 20%, which became the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, was not under Israeli control until 1967. What became the West Bank was actually part of Eastern Palestine that the Zionist movement was willing to give to Palestine's neighbor, the Kingdom of Jordan, in return to a secret understanding they had before the 48 war that Jordan could annex that part of Palestine, which became the West Bank, in return for a very limited participation in a military effort by the Arab world to save the Palestinians. The Gaza Strip was created by Israel itself because they needed a place into which to push the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees that they were kicking out from the south of Palestine. After the 48 war, for a very important group of Israelis, Israeli generals, Israeli politicians, Israeli cultural figures, allowing the Jordanians to take over what became the West Bank was really seen as a terrible historical mistake. There were two reasons why after 1948, many important and prominent Israeli wished to continue the ethnic cleansing and take over not the remaining 20% of historical Palestine, which they did not take over in 1948. One reason was ideological. According to their understanding, the heart of the ancient Jewish land, homeland, which they believe that they have recreated after 2,000 years of exile, the heart of that ancient Jewish homeland, a kind of an interpretation of the Old Testament, which of course doesn't have a map or any clear geographical references, but that doesn't matter. They saw the Old Testament, the Bible, as a kind of an historical book. The heart of that homeland was in the West Bank, the sacred cities for Judaism, or the tombs of those who were supposed to be the fathers of the Hebrew nation thousands of years ago, were buried in the cities of Hebron, Bethlehem, and other historical sites inside the West Bank. So that was one motive for taking over the West Bank. The second motive was strategic. They felt that the way the borders were shaped after an armistice agreement was signed with all the Arab countries that ended the 1948 war, that the particular border on the east with Jordan was not a defensible border. And they wished to have the Jordan River as a natural barrier, and believed that only if Israeli forces would be on the banks of that river, which meant that they had to swallow the area that today is called the West Bank, the Jewish state would become a viable state. Now, I know the people from Pakistan find it very difficult to visit Palestine. I don't know if any of you has ever managed to do that. So I don't think that you've ever seen the River Jordan. But the River Jordan is very small, a very narrow river, and you can jump over it, even if you're not a very good athlete. And therefore, it was not really a serious argument that this was a natural barrier, like a huge river that can be, at that time, be regarded as really a barrier for an invading army. But the basic idea was adherence to the settler colonial ideology of Zionism. In 48, they didn't take the whole of Palestine, and they still had a number of Palestinians inside Palestine. The problem for them was that once they occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the June 67 war, they did achieve a territorial takeover of the country that they deemed as the ancient Israel that belonged to the Jewish people. But on the other hand, incorporating these areas meant adding Palestinians into the Jewish state after kicking out 1 million Palestinians in 1948. And that created a conundrum, a problem for Israel after 1967. Every settler colonial movement had these two dimensions of space and people, or geography and demography. So in terms of space and geography, the Zionist movement achieved its ultimate goal, the takeover of all of historical Palestine. In terms of demography, it was far away from resolving what it deemed as a major problem if you wanted to create a Jewish state and you had a large number of Palestinians in it. Much larger after you occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which included a lot of refugees that were the victims of the Israeli ethnic cleansing in 1948. On purpose, I'm not going into the circumstances of how the 67 war erupted. If you want, we can deal with it in the Q&A question. The book, although the book challenges the accepted narrative that Israel was facing a second Holocaust in 67 and therefore had to go to war against the Arab world and by miracle defeated 7 Arab armies. I challenge that in the book as well, but it's not the major purpose of the book. The major purpose of the book is to show that settler colonialism is an apt paradigm, an entry point for understanding the Zionist and later Israeli action towards the Palestinians until today. And I'm particularly interested in the book in the strategic decision Israel took after it occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As you may know, the June 67 war was very short. It lasted only for 6 days. That's why the Israeli call it the 6 Days War. And in the end of the war, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that until 1967 were respectively under Jordanian rule and Egyptian rule. Now, the Israeli government sat quite intensively and met in order to decide how to deal with a major problem that Israel had as a settler colonial state. And I repeat it for the last time. They had the territory that they wanted, but they had not resolved the demographic issue from their perspective. So they took several decisions in 1967 that none of the Israeli government since 1967 has ever deviated from these several decisions, which I will enumerate in a minute. These decisions are not only the basis for the Israeli strategy towards the question of Palestine today, they also entail the vision of Israel for the future and tells you a lot about the Israeli actions or what we can expect from Israeli policies in the near future. The first decision was that Israel needs to control the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, can never give up its control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There was an argument, and still is an argument, in Israeli politics, whether that means that you need to rule directly these areas, or you can rule them indirectly, or you can partition them into an area which belongs to you and an area which you control from the outside. The Israelis until today are looking for all kinds of combinations between direct rule of these areas and indirect rules, but there's no intention and never was any intention to concede ruling over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That was the first decision, the territorial decision, if you want to. The second decision was that Israel cannot do in 67 what it did in 1948. In 1948, almost in every area that it took over, it expelled the population, the Palestinian population from there. It was decided eventually by the Israeli government not to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I have to say two things about this. One is that there was a serious contemplation to do it. They nearly did it, but they decided that the world will not allow it, and that and they also felt that this was already the age of television. It would be too transparent, and there were other considerations, but eventually, none of them were moral consideration, by the way, but eventually they decided against massive expulsion, although one should say that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled in the years of occupation since 67. Now, the third decision was, and that was the most important decision, which explains why so many people around the world, including in Pakistan, feel so strongly about Palestine. I think their third decision is the most important one. Because as you know, it's not that what the Israelis are doing is not the worst crime upon earth today. Atrocities, especially in the area we are in, the Arab world, the atrocities are quite tremendous. Africa has its own share of brutality, as does parts of Europe. So this is not the reason, I think, why Palestine is so important to so many people. It is the inhumanity that is not acknowledged, that Israel decided upon in its third resolution, that I think is at the heart of the wide support, unfortunately not so much by government, but by civil societies around the world for the Palestine question. The third decision was the following. If Israel is not if Israel retains the territories and is not expelling the people who live there, the millions of Palestinians who live there, does that mean that these Palestinians would be citizens of the state of Israel? Because if they would be citizens of the state of Israel, the Jews will not be a majority, or would be only a small majority in the land of Israel, which was contrary to the Zionist vision of an exclusive ethnic Jewish state. So it was very clear that these Palestinians would not be granted citizenship. In fact, they would not be granted any civic rights, and that means that they were not granted any human rights as well. And there was an interesting discussion in the Israeli government at the time when one of the ministers asked the Minister of Defense at the time, the famous General Moshe Dayan, he said to him, how many years can people live in a kind of a citizenless citizenship? Namely, how many years do you think millions of people would be able to live without any basic civic rights and basic human rights? I mean, is not this a problem for us? And Dayan, the general, who was the Minister of Defense, said, well, I think we can have them in such a situation for 50 years and even more. And I think that's a decision that Israel has, for which Israel created a bureaucracy, which I call in my book the bureaucracy of evil. Israel created a huge bureaucracy in order to handle the life of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as people without citizenship rights and without basic human rights. And for that, you need an apparatus that makes sure that you control and regulate the life of people who probably, as happened, would resist this kind of imprisonment. I talk about why did I call the book The Biggest Prison on Earth? Because There was actually a fourth decision, decision number 4, not immediately after the war. That kind of unfolded a bit later. That decision was to offer the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip two models, which, and this is my language, not the Israeli language, but I compare these two models into two kinds of prisons. There was the open prison model, where the Palestinians were told that in certain areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Palestinians could run their own affairs as if they were under a Palestinian municipality, collect the garbage, collect some taxes, and so on. But that is the limit of their self-governance. Israel has the right to take over parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and settle Jews in it, and eventually turn it into part of the Israel or part of the Jewish state. And in return, Palestinians could also work in the labor market in Israel and have some benefits if they continue to accept this model that those of you who are familiar with South Africa was the model of Bantustan, which the apartheid government offered the Africans and the ANC rejected and fought against. So the Bantustan model was the open prison model. If the Palestinians rejected the model, and the first time the Palestinians rejected that model was in 1987, in the first uprising, what the Palestinians called the Intifada, the first Intifada in 1987, the punishment for not accepting the open prison model was to be introduced into the kind of a maximum security prison model that is imposed on the population as a whole, not just on those who are actively resisting the Israeli occupation, but the population as a whole is enclaved in such a prison. We have today one of the worst version of this maximum security prison, which is the Gaza Strip, that Israel, although Israel took out the settlers, the few thousand settlers who were there, because the Hamas is not accepting the Israeli control, it is under siege and blockade and is treated as a maximum security prison. The West Bank was treated like this between 1987 and 1991, and once more when it resisted again this Israeli model of open prison in the second Intifada in 2000. Now, this maximum security prison is not just does not consist only on total freeze on freedom of movement, freedom of work, basic freedoms of individuals and collectives. It is also accompanied by massive collective punishments that are inflicted by the military. It could be a bombardment from the air by modern aircrafts, or by tanks, or in the case of the Gaza Strip, by Navy boats that would bombard Gaza from the sea, demolition of houses, imprisonment of people without trial, executions, and expulsions. And this was particularly severe in the reaction to the second uprising. The greatest Israeli success, which I think is now being questioned in the world, but until recently it was undoubtedly a success. The greatest Israeli success was to sell to the world, and even to some Palestinians, the open prison model as a peace process, as a peace solution. To call it the two-state solution, as if the Bantustan that the open prison model offered was actually an offer for a Palestinian sovereign Palestinian state, which, if you look at all the Israeli proposals for the two-state solution, or what I call the open prison model, whether these are the Oslo Accord in 1993 or the Israeli peace proposals in 2000 and up to 2007, they do not include the creation of an independent sovereign state. They include the idea of a Bantustan next to Israel. Israeli policies changed somewhat in 2009 when Benjamin Netanyahu became the Israeli prime minister. We are now in the Netanyahu decade. He was elected once to prime minister in 1996, but that was for a very short period. But since 2009 until today, he continuously is the prime minister of Israel. Now, he has his own understanding of these two models that I talked about, but also is motivated by the ideology of settler colonialism. Namely, remember, the whole idea is that you have the territory, but whatever you do, you are still faced with the fact that Palestinians are there. Not only that Palestinians are there, that they are resistant, that they are steadfast, that they are not giving up. Even the 5 million and so refugees are still thinking about returning. And definitely those under military rule and oppression are still continuing to struggle against it. And those who are fortunate enough to become the citizens of Israel, this is the Palestinian minority remaining inside Israel, they're still struggling against the apartheid nature of the state of Israel when it comes to their own rights. His idea is very different, and you can see it in the way that he concocted a plan together with the Trump administration called the deal of the century, of which I'm sure you've heard. And with this, I would nearly come to the end of my presentation. The idea of Trump and Netanyahu, and it's not just these two people and the people around them who helped them to strategize, is the following: that the best solution that Israel can hope for is not anymore the question of how much territory Israel takes and how much Palestinians it is able to either enclave and jail into small Bantustans or even expel. The most important Israeli mission, and this is something new which hasn't been attempted before by Israel and the United States, the best way of solving this issue and make the settler colonial project of Zionism as historical success is by depoliticizing the Palestine question, by claiming actually that there was never a Palestine problem, that the people who lived in Palestine before Zionism arrived and the people who lived in Palestine after the Zionist movement arrived are actually not part of a national political movement. It's not a group of people who have any political rights, be it the right of self-determination, the right for independence, the right of refugees to return. It is a group of people that may have economic or humanitarian needs, but these could be solved by funding, by money. And it will be solved by money if these people would give up any political demand. And this is at the heart of Donald Trump's deal of the century and the Netanyahu, but more importantly, Benjamin Netanyahu's interpretation of the deal of the century. There's few elements in this deal that and other actions that accompany the deal that should be noted. One is the fact that the United States has moved its embassy to Jerusalem. This is not just a challenge to the Palestinian national demand that Jerusalem would be the future state of future capital of a Palestinian state. This is also demanding Jewish supremacy over a holy city to Christianity and Islam. That's part of the depoliticization. The second one is a set of Israeli laws. I don't have time to enumerate them all, but there are many Israeli laws that do not allow Palestinians who are under Israeli control to mention 1948 as a catastrophe or to talk about the Palestinian national rights. And the last bit of this action is that already parts that have been ethnically cleansed within the West Bank should now be officially annexed to the state of Israel. The rule here, or the formula here, is very simple. If you succeeded by a matrix of intimidation, settlements, all kinds of harassment, to empty a part of the West Bank from its indigenous native Palestinians, then you can officially annex it to Israel. They don't want to repeat the mistake of 67 of annexing areas which are heavily populated by Palestinians because they're, as a settler colonial state, the demography is important to them. You may ask, why do they care about this demographic question, which would be a good question, and with this I would strive to conclude. In fact, until recently, the leading kind of ideological force in Zionism was really keen to have Israel both as an ethnic, I would say, a racist state, and a purely Jewish state, and a democratic state as well. And the only way that a Jewish state can be a democratic state if the Jews are the exclusive majority or the exclusive population in it. And that's why they kept playing with all these solutions of how to have the territory without the people when the historical circumstances did not enable them to get rid of the people. There is a new view now that comes from what we call the right wing in Israel, which says, well, look around the world, look at the people who are now ruling the world. They wouldn't mind, actually, if Israel would be an apartheid state in 2020. Namely, it doesn't have to do all these games of expelling people. It's totally plausible to have two communities in what would become the greater Israel, that is Israel with the West Bank and eventually also with the Gaza Strip, or keep the Gaza Strip as a kind of a maximum security prison that is ruled by the Hamas. You can have them, all the Palestinians, as second-rate or third-rate citizens. You have the security apparatus to maintain that apartheid regime. There are enough corrupt politicians around the world who would support this and will not object to it. The Palestinians don't have the military power to resist this regime. The Arab world, many of their regimes are easily intimidated or bought into acceptance of this kind of a rule, and therefore there's nothing wrong with that kind of idea, because democracy is overrated and there's no need for this. This is the big debate in Israel now, whether between a group that wants Israel still to remain a democracy and for that purpose is willing to perpetrate ethnic cleansing, enclaving the Palestinians in Bantustans on the one hand, and those who say we don't need all these actions because there's nothing wrong of keeping people at a level of second-rate or third-rate citizenship, which, by the way, they say anyway would prompt many of them to leave, so this will happen in any case. To sum up, this is not a very nice picture that I'm depicting here, but I think there are three very short conclusions with which I would like to end. The first one is that all the discourse and discussion on the two-state solution, that is a Palestinian state next to Israel, as the best solution and only plausible solution, should be stopped. The two-state solution is dead, is not a realistic solution, and the constant international preoccupation with this solution enabled Israel to deepen the colonization of Palestine as a whole, and provided Israel with international immunity to the oppression of the Palestinians. That's the first conclusion. The second conclusion is that the Palestinians need to present a counter deal to the deal of the century, and they will not be able to do it if they will not be united, and they're not united. And it's up to them to be united and present a vision that is adapted to the 21st century and defines well the project of liberation of Palestine in this century. And finally, it's time for the international community, and this includes particularly the West, but also countries like India and China. It's time for these countries to understand that for years they provided immunity for the colonization of Palestine. They wronged the Palestinians for years. And they have a moral duty, some countries more than others, for the liberation and freedom of Palestine. At the top of the list is Britain, that holds the responsibility in many ways for the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but not only Britain, of course, also the United States for years of supporting Israel, and other countries as well. The civil society in the world already understands it. It's just that the political elites and the mainstream media in many countries in the world are unwilling, for whatever reason, to confront Israel and to bring an end to a very one of the worst injustices upon earth today. So I will stop here and would very happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
So before moving to Q&A, I just have a couple of questions. Like you mentioned that the British decision to leave Palestine and to entrust its future to the United Nations while they were leaving. So the question is, why the British left to the
Yeah.
United Nations? Like, or before the leaving began, they have the connection with the Zionist movement. One. The second question is, you have mentioned that the second pro-Zionist constellation was there in the United Nations. Can you tell us about what was that pro-Zionist constellation in the United Nations? And the third that's connected to it, that Haji Aminul Husseini, when he presented the case in the United Nations rejected the Palestinian leadership demand for a democratic process for determining future of the country. So why they did it? That these three are the basic questions. Then we can move forward.
Okay, very good, very good. Three questions. First of all, Britain. There were a few reasons why Britain decided to end its rule in Palestine. First of all, and the most important one, Britain ceased to be an empire after the Second World War. It suffered economically, and the Labour Party that took over from the Conservatives in 1945, the Clement Attlee government, as you know, began also to think seriously about the eviction of withdrawal from India. And once you withdraw from India, or you think even of withdrawing from India, some parts of the Middle East are less important, because they were important on the way to India. They were not important by themselves unless they had oil. But Palestine didn't have any oil or petrol. So that was one reason. The second reason is that after the Second World War, Jewish terrorism began to be directed not only against the Palestinians, Zionist terrorism, which is not Jewish terrorism, Zionist terrorism began to be directed also against the British soldiers and officials in Palestine. The British paid a high price for staying in a place that really was not anymore a strategic asset for the empire. For these reasons, I think, and particularly the economic crisis in 46, 47, the winter of 46 was particularly bad for Britain. The Americans demanded back some of the money that they loaned to the British in the Second World War, really made, from their point of view, a logical decision that there was no need to keep Palestine, which drew a lot of soldiers into fighting both Zionist resistance and Palestinian resistance on the ground. The second question is about I think it was about, the constellation in the United Nations, the Zionist constellation. So first of all, I mentioned, and let me repeat it, many of the countries that would become member states in the 60s and the 70s as a result of the process of decolonization were still colonies and could not vote in the United Nations. India was an exception in a way, because there was an Indian representative in 47 in the United Nations. Actually, he supported Haj Amin al-Husseini's view. I'll come back to it in a minute. But the constellation was not that much in favor of Zionism, but the United States exerted pressure on all the countries to support the United Nations idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. What also helped the Zionist movement, which is quite surprising maybe, that the Soviet Union under Stalin at that time thought wrongly, by the way, that the Zionist settler colonial project would lead to the creation of a Marxist Zionist state that could be part of the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War. They misunderstood the interaction between Marxism and nationalism in the case of Zionism. And therefore, the Soviet Union supported the creation of the State of Israel and also the countries that were under its influence. So that explains the constellation in the United Nations. But all in all, one should say something in general about it. The people who were members of states, or those who were member states in the United Nations, felt that they have a way of dealing with one of the most unpleasant chapters in the history of Europe, the Holocaust. What the Zionist movement offered, it said, okay, you can close the chapter on what you did to the Jews, not only to the Jews, what they did to millions of people in the Second World War, by supporting the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, and at least the Jewish movement, the Jewish national movement, would not badger you about what you had done during the Second World War. It was kind of a formula. The last question is, and it's very interesting to read I forgot his name now. He was a Muslim from India who was the ambassador to the United Nations and was a member of the United Nations Inquiry Commission that was supposed to offer a solution for the Palestine question after the British withdrawal. And he rejected the idea of partition. He said, actually, and he wrote a very interesting report, totally understanding why this was a bad idea and supporting the Palestinian position that if you want to be loyal to the principles of democracy, if you want to be loyal to the principle of self-determination and independence, Palestine belongs to the Palestinians as much as Egypt belongs to the Egyptians and as Iraq belongs to the Iraqis. And you need a democratic vote in Palestine to decide what would be the nature of a free Palestine. Now, of course, the Zionist movement objected to this idea because the Zionists were only 1/3 of the population. And not only that, most of them were immigrants or settlers who arrived in Palestine 3 or 4 years before. It just, as I say to friends in Britain who do not understand, I said, imagine if a minority of immigrants, doesn't matter where they come from, a minority of immigrants from Britain, who would be 15% of the British population, would be granted, would get half of Britain as an independent state. What would you as people of Britain say to such an idea as a solution? It was contrary to any logic. But the only thing would work was this coalition that worked against the Palestinians.
And the last part was about Haj Aminul Husseini when he presented the argument. So why did the United Nations did not accepted it? What was the politics behind it?
Well, no, the two different things here. I think there's kind of a confusion here. The United Nations did not accept the idea of one democratic state for the reasons that I explained. Haj Amin Husseini himself did not appear before the United Nations. A relative of his, Jamal Husseini, repeat. Haj Amin Husseini was the acknowledged leader of the Palestinians, but he was under a cloud, so to speak, after 1945, because he was suspected, and the Zionists made a big deal out of it, as being a collaborator with the Nazis during the Second World War. The truth of the matter is that in 1938, he was leading a Palestinian uprising against the pro-Zionist policies of Britain in Palestine. He was sentenced to death, and he escaped from Palestine. And like so many in the Arab world, at the time in 1938, people believed that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And the enemy of Britain at the 1938 were Italy and Germany. I think he lost a bit of his political reasoning when he decided to go even further and find refuge in Berlin in the Second World War, and was willing to broadcast in the in the Nazi broadcast against Britain when it was already clear that the Nazi Germany was genociding the Jews. That was a terrible mistake of his. There's no doubt about it. There's no need to stand for him in this. But it was a very minor affair in his life. It didn't have any impact on either the Holocaust or the development of the Second World War. And he regretted it himself afterwards. And he was still the acknowledged leader of the Palestinians after 1945. And he headed a committee which was called the Arab Higher Committee, which was the kind of the government of the Palestinians, democratically elected, representing the vast majority of the people in Palestine. And the United Nations should have listened to the majority of the people and not to the minority settler movement. This was really a violation of the basic collective rights of the Palestinians. The United Nations made another mistake. After it was clear that the Palestinians would not accept the United Nations idea of partition, the United Nations should have said, okay, let's go back to the negotiation table and find a better solution. No, what they did was to declare the Palestinians as warmongers and say to the Israelis, you have the right to impose the United Nations solution by force, which in many ways brought the catastrophe that befell on the Palestinians in 1940.
So you're referring to Indian Muslim leader Abul Kalam Azad?
Sorry?
The Muslim leader from India. You were referring to Abul Kalam
Yes,
Azad?
yes, he's the man. Yes, yes, yes. He was a
Okay,
representative.
sir. So
Yeah.
you talk about military regulation number 109 that says we can expel the population. Military regulation 110, right to summon any citizen. 111, arrest for unlimited period. When you talk about these military regulations, you have mentioned in the book that these regulations were firstly used by British mandate, and while they were being used by the British mandate, the Zionist International at that time,
True.
they used to say that these are the laws that even not being used by the Nazi party in Germany, and they rejected these laws. But when they came in power, they used these military regulations. So, what is this dichotomy is all about?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like when we understand that abused people can be abusive. You know, when an abused child can become an abusive parent, or a victim can be a victimizer himself. Yes, the state of Israel, both in the period between 1948 to 1967, with regard to the Palestinian minority that remained inside Israel after 48, and with regard to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, used emergency regulation that really robbed the Palestinians of any basic human and civil rights that were used against them for a very short period by the British authorities in Palestine in the years 45 to 47, when the Zionist movement were trying to accelerate the British withdrawal from Palestine through a campaign of terrorism and guerrilla warfare. So I think that, you know, if you ask Israelis how is it possible to impose regulations on Palestinians that you yourself declared are similar to Nazi regulations, they would not see any problem with it, because they would claim that this is a different story, because the Palestinians are intend to destroy the state of Israel. They want to kill the Jews. I mean, all kinds of things that they've heard from the Israeli propaganda over the years that justifies in their eyes all kinds of actions taken by their own government against the Palestinians. One should add that I talked about Zionism as a settler colonial paradigm, and I talked about Israel as a settler colonial state. One important feature of all settler colonial projects in history is that they totally dehumanize the native. So they never treat them as full human beings, and therefore it enables them to do these horrible things. In the case of Zionism, there was another. I don't know if I mentioned it in this book, but I wrote a whole book about it. How the Israeli authorities, I call it, Nazify the Palestinians. Namely, they created in the minds of people this associate, as if this idea that the Palestinians are continuing with the same ideology that the Nazis had towards the Jewish people, and that therefore justifies the kind of cruelty and brutality that Israel is using against the Palestinians wherever they are.
So you talk about a famous novel written by Amos Oz, My Michael,
Yes.
and you says that these type of novel create the imagination, and you have mentioned in your book too that in the novel My Michael, when he talk about that the sheeps are just strolling in some whereabouts, and you says that even at that time when he was writing the novel, the sheeps was not there. So my question is, how in the war of narratives, these false imagination plays the role, because we have seen in Pakistan, the official historian of Pakistan is I.H. Qureshi. So
Okay.
when he write the history in Pakistan, he does the same things, like we are different from India for
Yeah.
5,000 years and all that. So how did this all begin? The imaginations being different, as you mentioned in the novel My Michael.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, I wrote a book which is called The Idea of Israel. And in my book, The Idea of Israel, I try to show, I go even deeper into this question that you raised, how Israeli writers, novelists, poets, film directors, painters were able to look at the land itself, in the country itself, and totally wipe out the Palestinian presence in it. Whether it's ignoring the fact that their colony is built on the ruins of a Palestinian village, or whether the house in which they lived actually belongs to a Palestinian, or that the recreational park in which they're having a picnic is actually the site of a Muslim graveyard on which European trees were planted. I think that novelists like Amos Oz, who were regarded in the world as as a peace person, as kind of representing the good side of Israel, uh, are part of this um, engineering of Israelis to totally be unaware of the crime that they have committed in 1948. But what is worse, as Edward Said used to say, what is worse, it's not a crime that was committed only in 1948. It's an ongoing crime. It continues to happen. You know, Palestinian villages are ethnically cleansed as we speak today. And in their stead, there will be a Jewish colony or a forest. And the next generation of Israelis will grow up thinking that this was an empty land. There was nothing there before this particular settlement was built, or that particular recreational park was planted. It's a very important part of any settler colonial project to totally um, expunge the native population from memory, from history, from your imagination. There is one particular manifestation of this, are the Israeli painters. Not now. The Israeli painters who painted even before 1948 landscape, which we know had Palestinian villages on it. There's no doubt about it. I recognize in the painting the places. And I know that they were painting a hill with a huge Palestinian village on it. In their painting, the hill is without the village, which was an ominous sign for that village. And if you, again, if you were able to visit what I call the apartheid wall in Israel, the barrier that Israel has built around certain parts of the West Bank, the Israelis decorated parts of that wall with drawings that supposedly depict the scenery on the other side of the wall. But in that particular depiction, you see only nature. There are no villages, no towns. They are expunged from the picture. So, yes, in order to maintain this idea in the 21st century that a whole nation does not exist, you need also to work on the imagination of people. And novelists are very important, not just historians, for working on the imagination of people.
Sir, the title of your book is The Biggest Prison on Earth. And rightly at the quite end of the book, you have mentioned that 3 million Palestinians are living in the West Bank alone, and about zero point 0.5 million in Gaza Strip. While I was, for the first time at the beginning of this year, when I was reading the title, The Biggest Prison on Earth. So the very first time when I read this title, Kashmir came to my mind,
Oh, yes.
because these all regulations, this military regulation 109, 110, 111, they are all there, and expulsions are there, and no internet access. So how it is possible that and for example, the counterinsurgency operations that the Israeli forces takes, the Indian forces have also learned these tactics. For example, as you mentioned, that going on destroying the homes, burning down the whole villages, they have also learned these tactics from the Israeli counterparts in the training program, what and in the exchange programs of the forces, what they do. Why it is that one country always learn the fascistic tactics from other country? Why not the opposite?
Yeah. Well, the case of Kashmir is very interesting in a way because uh, you have to go back, first of all, in a wider context to the relationship between India and the State of Israel. And I would go back even to the 1930s. In the 1930s, the Zionist philosophers really admired, already then admired Mahatma Gandhi as a kind of a figure which they saw was really someone to follow. And there's a famous correspondence between a Jewish philosopher who became a Zionist, Martin Buber, and Gandhi, in which he tries to elicit Mahatma Gandhi to support the idea of Zionism in Palestine. And Gandhi refuses. He says, no, what you are doing in Palestine is not different from what the British are doing in India. And that's why in Israel, until today, there's no street named after Mahatma Gandhi. It's the only place in the world that they don't recognize it. And then you had even, the time of Nehru, let's say, the early 50s, where Nehru was in good relationship with Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the kind of non-alignment attempt to create a kind of something, at least basically, um, there was kind of a ideological affinity between the Palestinian liberation movement and some part of the Indian public opinion or civil society. Definitely, there was a close relationship with the Muslim minority inside India. But since the early 90s, since I would say since Israel established official diplomatic ties with India in 1992, this whole context has changed. And both countries are using the same discourse, the same means in order to fight against something which is basically a democratic demand for self-determination and basic human rights. And they are supporting each other in that project. And I think there are also similarities in the way the Indians are presenting, Jammu and Kashmir as a place that has a special autonomy according to the Indian constitution and so on. It's the same. One should write about it. How Israelis and Indians are abusing rather than using the term autonomy in order actually to explain indirect or direct control in order not to respect the rights of people. Um, it's still a very interesting constellation because, in the Indian embassy, for instance, in Tel Aviv, there are two figures. You have the Indian ambassador, which is really not important. He's not an important person. But you have the military attaché. And the military attaché is really the important person. And for me, it's very sad because, as I said, there is a history of connection between the Palestinian movement and important section of the Indian civil societies that for years understood each other, knew what anti-colonialism meant, what the struggle for human rights meant. And this is all going because of Indian Hindu nationalism, I think is going to be lost. And, India as well as China are two countries that once we had these big hopes that would replace the United States that played such a negative role in the history of Palestine. And we always said, oh, one day, you know, this international superpower constellation would change, and these new tigers would come. We have now, by the way, similar hopes from the Muslim countries. I was in Kuala Lumpur during the December meeting. I still think we would like, especially the Muslim countries in your part of the world, to play a far more important role and to help us counterbalance not only the coalition that supports Israel against the Palestinians, but also to kind of counter the Israeli invention, I call it, the American-Israeli invention, that the only counter alliance there is consists of fanatic Islamists like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. You know, we need to build a counter coalition with Malaysia, with the people in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and Muslims in South Africa. Without that, it would be very difficult to help in the solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Why I mentioned Kashmir was when you compare the population, the whole population of Kashmir is above 12 million, and that fits in the narrative of open air prison, because no one can go out, no one can bring into that state. So when you talk about Gandhi, so you have mentioned one General Levy, that he was famously called in Israel as Gandhi.
Oh yes,
General Gandhi.
Yes,
and it was so astonishing to me that I thought that it's because of some good traits, and you mentioned that it's just because he had the darker color.
It's totally racist. Because he had a darker, you know, some of the Jews who came from to Palestine came from Arab countries, some came from Muslim countries, some came from even a small group came from India, some intermarried. So you have Jews with darker complexion. And he had particular dark complexion in the eyes of these white Israelis, and that's why they called him Gandhi. And I know it's such an abuse, because he was particularly a nasty person. I mean, he was particularly racist and committed war crimes against the Palestinians. So it's even more cynical that he had this nickname. But yeah, nothing to do with anything that, you know, the universalist position of Gandhi about humanity. No, nothing of it, unfortunately.
Okay, so we're moving for the Q&A, and whoever is going to ask a question, you should introduce yourself, and if possible, you can turn on the camera so Professor ILLANPAPPE can see you. Stephanie, do you have a question?
They need to unmute, probably.
And to plug in a headphone, so
okay, now we can hear you. Yeah. We can hear you. Good.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation. And yeah, as I said, your books were amazing, and in general, the open speaking and so on. I have a question that's maybe a little bit weird, but somehow it's an aspect I'm somehow interested into. And this is somehow the aspect of Arab Jews in Israel. For instance, here in Germany, we have so-called Russian Germans. They are, yeah, if you want to say, they're ethnically Germans who migrated to Russia 100, 200, and partially even longer years ago. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they came to Germany. There were even specific laws to make the so-called back migration of them easier. And many of them came here, yeah, first of all, because of the bad circumstances back then after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, simply to move to a better economy. but also they thought when they come here, they will be welcomed as, yay, Germans coming back. And this was not the case. Until today, they're actually considered as Russians, and not only because they do speak Russian or they speak weird German, which since long time no one is speaking here, or the heavy Russian accent, and somehow the mentality, to us, they feel very Russian. So they were kind of disappointed and how the society regards them, that they're here Russians suddenly and not Germans anymore. And this somehow led to the weird circumstance that nowadays these so-called Russian Germans, that they are among the strongest supporters of right-wing parties in Germany. And I often think, yeah, maybe this is one of the reasons what happens when you have kind of an identity crisis, like you always felt like a German and the entire society is treating you like the foreigner. And now you feel under the pressure to prove that you are German and maybe even more German than the most Germans, kind of. And I always wondered, how is it actually with the Arab Jews in Israel? Because, or maybe it's my own stupidity, or maybe I'm being a bit naive here, but to me, I would have considered them as Arabs. I mean, I also don't distinguish between an Arab Muslim or an Arab Christian. To me, they're Arabs. They're speaking Arab in daily life. They're listening to the same music. They share the same language, partial mentality, etc. So I always thought that they probably consider themselves also as kind of an Arab, and then they end up in a society which is dominated by Zionism, which is more or less somehow an ideology of white European or and US American Jews. So, and I know what mistreatments, for example, Jews from Yemen, for example, experienced. And I'm wondering how these people nowadays feeling within Israel. Is it like, for sure there's still discrimination, is it like they want to be more Israeli than the white Israelis, or is it somehow that they maybe think or reconsider, actually we are somehow also Arabs, and maybe we should somehow be more in solidarity with our Arab brothers and sisters in the Palestinian neighborhoods and in the Palestinian occupied territories, etc. I mean, I'm not sure if I can somehow explain properly what my question is, but what do you think? What is the role of these Arab Jews in Israel in regard of Palestinian rights? What you think?
Yeah, definitely. No, I fully understand the question. It's a bit different from the situation you described in Germany, although maybe there are some parallels. First of all, we have to remember that the Zionist movement at first was not interested in bringing Jews from Arab countries because he wanted to create a European Jewish country. But because of the Holocaust, and because the fact that after the Holocaust, the American and especially British Jews did not make it to Palestine as the Zionist movement wanted them to, they needed to increase the number of Jews in Palestine, and that's when they began a massive campaign to convince the Jews who lived in Arab countries and in North Africa to come to Israel. And eventually, between 1948 to 1950, 1 million of them arrived in Israel. And as you rightly said, they were not considered to be equal Jews. They were pushed to the social and geographical margins of the Israeli society. In a way, they were treated like Arabs. And because of that, they needed to de-Arabize themselves. They needed to show that they are not Arabs and in a way betray their own identity, history, and culture. And they tried very hard to prove that they are not Arabs. And one of the ways of doing it is to show great animosity towards the Arabs, unfortunately. And therefore, instead of becoming an electorate maybe, or a community that may have helped to build bridges between Jews and Arabs, they became the electoral base for the political parties in Israel that totally reject any dialogue or peace with Palestinians, and still are. Many of them still believe in those parties. So on the one hand, they suffer from European Jews like the Arabs did in terms of discrimination, attitudes, racism. On the other hand, they believe that if they succeed in becoming true Israelis, which means totally convincing people that they are not Arabs, then the discrimination would stop and they would become equal citizenship, which will never happen, I think, because the elite in Israel is a European Jewish elite. But that doesn't prevent them from still attempting to do this. One should say there's a small group of activists among them who call themselves Arab Jews, and as you defined it, they accept the same definition. Unfortunately, it's a very small group, an important group, but it doesn't reflect the community at large. And it's a great pity. I also want to add that Israel invested a lot of effort to make sure that these Jews who came from Arab countries would not be in any contact with the Palestinians who were citizens of Israel, because naturally they wanted to be in touch with each other, the same language, the same culture, the same background. But Israel made sure that this kind of interaction would not be possible in order to create a Jew that used to be Arab, but one day will be a proper Jew by sort of de-Arabizing themselves. So for me, it's a very sad story of people who had to deny their own rich culture and so on. And some of them understand it, but they still want to be accepted by the Israeli Jewish society and care less about the Palestinians. But there's this group of activists that I hope one day will be able to change attitudes even in this community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next question.
May I have a question, please?
Of course.
Okay, my name first is Ahmed. I didn't introduce myself. I am Palestinian from the second generation. My father
Yes.
was a little baby when my grandfather has to leave Akka.
Okay.
My question is, I didn't prepare myself quite well for the question, so it's a little bit too abstract. To
Don't
which
worry.
extent, because usually I go in, also I live in Germany, and sometimes I make presentations more than 50% based on your amazing book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. But usually people try to ask me about areas before, and the question is, to which extent can I describe, to which extent did the Zionist elite in Palestine, especially during the Nakba or shortly before the Nakba, were aware or planning to expel the Palestinians? Was it mainly the group that you built your book around them, who were in this, I can't remember exactly the term you gave them, the consultancy group? Exactly. Was mainly these, or was, I mean that the elite, political, military elite, or also economical? And I know this would take too long time, but I mean, for example, man can see the roots of the expelling the Palestinians from Theodor Herzl, and not any less. But during the time, do you think one can have like trend or a line was less or more presence in the ideas of the leaders of the Zionist community in Palestine, the idea of expelling the Palestinians? I hope the question is clear, not too...
Yeah, very clear, very clear.
Okay, thank you.
Very clear, thank you. Yes, this is why I started my lecture today by talking about settler colonialism and the logic of the elimination of the native. And ethnic cleansing is a way of eliminating the native. I think it's part of the DNA of Zionism. It's not only the group that decided to do the particular ethnic cleansing of the Nakba that is the only one that is part of this idea. No, I think from the very beginning, and you're right to go back to Theodor Herzl, who writes that the Palestinians should be removed from Palestine if you want to create a Jewish state. it's only a matter of means and historical opportunity, not a matter of different moral position. So I'll give you an example. In the 1920s, the Zionist movement succeeds in buying land from Arab landowners who do not live in Palestine, who lived in Beirut, like the Susuk family. We call them absentee landlords. These were people who bought land in the 19th century in Palestine but never lived there. And the custom was that people who live in land lease the land to tenants. And the tenants are actually almost the owners of the land, because nobody, even if you change hands of ownership, the villages remain. You don't expel the villages. But the Zionist movement was the first force in Palestine in the 1920s that after it bought land, it demanded from the British authorities to evict the people who lived for centuries on that land. So ethnic cleansing there was small, in only 2 parts of Palestine, but it was ethnic cleansing. And 48 just gave the historical opportunity to do this, and the particular people who were there leading the Zionist movement were the ones who exercised it, implemented it. You know, today in Area C of the West Bank, which is more than 60% of the West Bank, ethnic cleansing continues. So it's not the consultancy of 48. It's Benjamin Netanyahu, it's his various ministers of defense, it's the various Israeli generals. Removing Palestinian from Palestinian territory is accepted as moral, necessary, and legitimate part of building a Jewish state in the eyes of most of the Zionists. I'm not saying that all of them agree. No, there are definitely some good people, conscientious Jews, even during the 48 events rejected this. But they are a very small minority, always were a small minority, and still are a small minority. And one of the reasons that they are still a small minority is that because the world is not yet telling them that this is wrong. It's amazing, 72 years, 73 years after the Nakba, they don't tell them this as yet. You know, when I published my book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, all the publishers in the world said to me, you can't call what Israel did as ethnic cleansing. This is not what Israel did to the Palestinians. But I insisted, and then the book became accepted, and people began to understand what the Palestinians have suffered over the years. But it's just a recent development. In the 1980s, if you as a Palestinians would talk about the Nakba as ethnic cleansing, people would say, no, it's your fault. It's the Palestinians' fault. You know, all this rubbish that was part of the Israeli propaganda. So we have to understand it, that it's a legitimate part of Zionist ideology and practice. So it's not only the group in 1948. They were at that historical juncture where they could implement a massive ethnic cleansing, which they felt afterwards, the leaders who came after them felt was impossible in the circumstances of the 1960s or today. I'm still afraid that they might do again a massive expulsion if they would feel that this is the only way of, you know, achieving their goals. I hope they wouldn't do it, and I think that we are in different historical circumstances. But it was never a moral question, unfortunately, for the Zionist or Israeli leadership. It was always a matter of, do we have the means to do it? And is this the right historical moment? And would the world allow us to do it or not? And this is harsh for me to say, as someone who comes from basically from Israel. But it's true. It's a bit like apartheid South Africa. There is no softer version of apartheid. There's no liberal apartheid. There were no liberal apartheid people. You were either for apartheid or you were against apartheid in South Africa. You could not be a liberal person who believes in apartheid. So to my mind, you cannot be a liberal person who believes in Zionism, or a Marxist believes in anyone with a universal point of view, doesn't matter which one it is, on humanity, cannot accept an ideology that sees the native as someone that has no right for his own homeland.
Hello, Professor. My name is Bilal.
Hello. Hello, Bilal.
I'm a researcher in public policy here in Pakistan. So I have some basic type of questions. Maybe some others are also interested in it. We see that the official state was established in 1948, and as you also explained that the first war was actually the one which achieved more was in 1948 only. The 67 one was a continuation, but they failed to achieve what they achieved actually in 1948. So actually, who was fighting this war? If I compare this dynamics with Pakistan and India, British left this both of the countries with institutions already present in it. So we had a formal army of Pakistan here in 47, and India also had a formal army, and those two formal armies went into war with each other over Kashmir in 1948. Whereas a country which was very recently formed, like in 48, in the case of Israel, where did the commission officers, the formal soldiers, the infantry, the weapons, how did this all, came in an organized manner that they were able to, ethnically cleanse this huge number of population from their native lands? This is my first question. And the second question was regarding the Soviet Union's perception of this is newly created state to be a Marxist one. What we have I have learned from my personal readings is that the Soviet Union actually encouraged the people to leave the Soviet Union with their without their money, and they were and at most of the time the Jewish population was kind of forced to leave the Soviet Union, and were they were facilitated by the Soviet Union to go over there, and this continued later on as well, because and the anima and later we see even in the time of Cold War, the Jewish were seen as a suspicion in the Soviet Union. So this seems to me a contradiction in this manner as well, and yeah, basically these two questions for now.
Okay, thank you, Bilal. As for the first question, it's very typical to situation where you have a settler community that wants to take over someone else's land and an indigenous native population. The indigenous native population usually is not busy in building an army or building even a campaign or a structure, because it believes that by nature of law, this is their country, and why should it not continue to be their country? A kind of a naivete, or naive, the kind of a naive position that is at the heart of this kind of relationship. And I can show you the difference in the way the Palestinian community and the Jewish community prepared for the 48 withdrawal of Britain. The Zionist movement from the very beginning built the military power and used their connection with the British military to train their soldiers and to have some military experience and to purchase armaments and so on. The Palestinians didn't do anything in that respect. They had some old weapons that they used for hunting. In the very last moment after, in the 1930s, they tried to, with most primitive weapons, to try and defeat the British Empire and paid a very high price in their popular resistance between 36 to 39. So when we arrive in 47, 48, until the 15th of May 1948, which was the official date of the end of the mandate, you have few thousand Palestinians with few hundreds volunteers from the Arab world facing 30,000 Jewish troops, very well armed and already very well trained. So and half of the ethnic cleansing already occurred before the 15th of May 1948. In fact, all the Palestinian towns were ethnically cleansed before the 15th of May 1948. What happened on the 15th of May 1948? Public opinion in the Arab world pressured the Arab governments to do something about it, especially after a very horrible massacre that happened in Deir Yassin in April 1948. So the Arab armies, by the way, the Arab regimes reluctantly sent troops into Palestine when already half of the Palestinians that became refugees were already ousted of the country, and tried to defend the rest of Palestine. And there was a proper war. I mean, these were proper armies: the Egyptian army, units from the Iraqi army, the Lebanese army. The Jordanian army is a different story because Israel, as I mentioned before, they had an agreement with Israel before. So the Jordanian army only fought in parts of Palestine, and it was hardly fought by the Israelis, but it was too late and too little in defending the Palestinians. This was the military balance. So you have two kinds, as I say in my book, Ethnic Cleansing. You had two wars. You have an official war, which lasted about 2 to 3 weeks, between troops that were sent from the Arab country against the Israeli army, and the Israeli army defeated them because they were much better trained. They got all kinds of weapons and armaments from the Soviet Union and from other countries, whereas Britain and France, which were the main arms supplier to the Arab armies, embargoed these armies. So that was one war. But the major military event, so to speak, was the military action by the Zionist forces and later the Israeli forces against the Palestinian civilian space. And there the Palestinians were quite defenseless. Although there was an Arab volunteer army, and some people fought very courageously from the villages themselves, but they had no chance against the Israeli forces. As for your second question, you're right. There is a contradiction, but there's a similar contradiction in the way that anti-Semitic people around the world who do not want to see Jews in their vicinity would love to see the Jews in Palestine. So in a way, it's not a contradiction. If you and some people in the Soviet Union, especially around Stalin, were anti-Semitic, and their anti-Semitism, you're absolutely right, led them to support the idea that the Jews would not be in the Soviet Union. But they had no objection for the Jews being in Palestine. And even if they could convince the Jews to build in Palestine a state that would support the Soviet Union in the Cold War against the United States, even better. In a similar way, Christian fundamentalists today, who are anti-Semites, don't want to see Jews in America. They don't want to see the Jews in Britain. They want to see the Jews in Palestine because in their case, they also believe that the return of the Jews to Palestine would bring back Jesus Christ, the resurrection of the dead. So it's kind of a double bill. You get rid of the Jews and you get back Jesus Christ. This is something that has to be understood, that anti-Semitism is not a reason not to support Israel. In some cases, anti-Semitism leads people to support Israel exactly for the reason that you've pointed, Bilal, because people don't want the Jews to be with them. So there's a kind of an alliance here between Zionism and anti-Semitism, and we can show it throughout history how it worked.
Maybe I would like to make also a short comment regarding this. For example, here in Germany, somehow maybe the country with the very weirdest controversy regarding Israel-Palestine, most Germans are very fine and fiercely defended that Palestinian refugees are not allowed to return back to their homes. For sure, because it's Palestinians who pay now the price for the crime of the Holocaust, while Germans still live in the houses they have stolen from Jews. In Germany, we have this, there's, how to explain in English, we have couple stones, golden couple stones, and in these golden couple stones, there is written in the name of the Jewish person who got deported from this building. It's directly in front of houses, for example, where a Jewish family used to live. and written the date of birth, written the date of deportation to a concentration camp, and written the day of death. And even here in this very, very small city I live in, we have many of these golden cobblestones. So you kind of get an idea what the number of 6 million Jews does mean. And but still there's people living in these houses, but it's not Jews, it's Germans. And they're happy, they still have this property. And it's not only these houses, it's companies and other stuff. They're happy that these Jews either died in the concentration camps or immigrated to other countries, like for instance Israel, and kind of this Western hypocrisy. You know, we feel super sorry, and as an apology, we don't give back what we have taken from you, but we give you something that does even not belong to us and is very far away from us. So that's definitely kind of weird mentality.
Yeah, true, absolutely. Yeah.
If I'm allowed to ask a second question, maybe a short one, because you mentioned that somehow in the Israeli mindset, people, and also thanks to propaganda, people are very good at ignoring Palestinian realities. Like we can sit in the park without knowing that this park is built on a Palestinian village or graveyard. Or we can draw landscapes and completely ignore that there's Palestinian villages actually in this landscape. We would not find them in the picture again. Nevertheless, it happens from time to time, and that Palestinians are able to visit their former homes, that they knock on the doors, and then the actual owner, the actually Palestinian owner of the house, does meet the nowadays Israeli owner of the house. And I can very, very well imagine and feel what the Palestinian does feel in that moment. But I always wonder what's going on maybe in the head of the Israeli in this moment. I mean, shouldn't there be kind of a crack? I mean, in this all this kind of denial, when, I mean, there's this political level and there's this very personal level, and there's suddenly this Palestinian knocking on my door and saying, can I have a look at my house where my grandparents or parents do come from, where I do actually have a family history with, where I still actually do know which picture should be hanging on the wall, you know. Can you maybe give me an idea what's maybe going on? I think it's also very individual. I mean, there's some Israelis who let them come in, and there's some Israelis who immediately shut the door and say, go away. But for sure, there's different stuff happening. But somehow, can you maybe describe what could maybe be an average going on in the mind of this Israeli person when someone is suddenly trying to crack the denial?
Yeah, well, we have few cases like this that happened especially after 1967, when Palestinian refugees were looking for their old homes inside Israel, and it was still possible to travel easily from the West Bank into Israel proper. We had some Palestinian refugees coming to visit in the first year or two after Oslo, and trying to visit the homes in which they used to live. In most cases, there were a few exceptions where the kind of process that you are talking about took place in the sense that people felt sorry, invited people inside, and felt something about it. But this was the exception, not the rule. The rule was that people said, no, this is our house. We received it from the Israeli government. You do not belong here. Kind of in between saying you are fabricating a history, or we don't care. Depends on which cases we are talking about. And it's part of this dehumanization that I was talking about, part of this state of denial that is very much part of the way Israelis look at the Palestinians. You have to remember that the early Zionists have looked at the Palestinians as people who had no right to be here, as people who usurped the ancient Jewish kingdom, that took over something which did not belong to them. So they never regarded their presence in the villages as something legitimate. So you would like to feel, to hope that people, maybe younger generation, would feel some compassion towards the suffering on a totally human basis. Forget about politics. And somewhere, someone is like this. They're not all made of the same stock, the Israelis. But in these cases, if you look at it politically or ideologically or morally, what is important is the general picture, not the few individuals, and they are who feel differently. It's very disappointing and it's very discouraging, but it means that we need to continue and work on it, those of us who work inside the Jewish society, because eventually I hope that this will be a successful project. We definitely succeeded in changing the views of young American Jews about it. And I think also some young Germans have changed their minds about it. So there's still hope, but it's very, very difficult. You're dealing with a very indoctrinated society, and the fact that someone would knock on the door and say to them, you know, this is my house, can you just let me in, just to look, I don't even want to kick you out, is not going to move them, not going to even make them care, and they will find a way of getting rid. As I say, there are exceptions, but I'm talking about the rule, unfortunately. But it's also because only recently they were exposed to all this history that was a kind of denied also to them. And so we need to be hopeful that in time this would be possible.
So talking about the future, when you say about the ODS, one democratic state solution, when on different occasions the Israeli government faced the question of apartheid, so they come up and say that no, the citizens that living inside the borders of Israel, the Arab Muslims, they have the voting right. So in South Africa, the blacks did not have the voting rights. So the difference between South Africa and here is that the South African apartheid knew that the blacks were in majority. So here they know that these are only 20%. And as we talk about ODS solution, one democratic state solution, supposing the same thing which the apartheid there in South Africa thought, if a larger chunk of population comes in, so the demographic changes will take place. So I don't see anything viable in this situation. And the last thing I want to point out is on the 7th of June this month, there was a protest in Tel Aviv against the annexation of the West Bank. How far is the number? I know that there were some Marxist Jews. There were some left-leaning young people over there. How far is that number is, and can you think that will be the pressure enough needed for the government to change its policies? And the first question that I mentioned about the ODS, how do you see that?
Yeah, and it might be the last question because at 8 o'clock I have another Zoom. I'm sorry, if that's okay. Two things. One is that you're right, the demographic balance is different, but not the principle. Israel is at the juncture now, especially after it's going to, and it will annex many parts of the West Bank. It's in a juncture. It can either cease to be an ethnic Jewish state and become a democratic state, and then it doesn't matter whether you are a Jew, a Palestinian, or a Christian, or a Muslim, on the basis of a democracy, where what matters is if you are a citizen, not your religious identity or even your national identity. Either you create a democracy with all the problems of after 100 years of a conflict. It won't be easy. It won't be easy. We see it in post-apartheid South Africa. It's a long process of reconciliation, restitution, with a lot of teasing problems. But that's one option. The second option is to continue the apartheid Israel, and risk that eventually, like in South Africa, this can fall down, but in a very bad way also for the Jewish population. So I think that the need to transform the ideology or the ideology of the regime is at the heart of the matter. Now, I know also from South Africa, and there the numbers were not important in that respect, I think. If you have an ideology that gives you all the privileges, you are not likely to give it up just because someone convinces you that it's immoral. You can convince 3 or 4 white people in South Africa that it was immoral. You force people to give up their privileges in a struggle from below, with boycotts from the outside, with the international community. And this might happen. I don't know if it will happen, but that's one possibility, that eventually Israeli Jews would have, not because they would be morally convinced that Zionism is wrong, but because they would convince that it's not working anymore. It's not working. But I'm not optimistic that it will happen in the next 10 or 15 years. It could be, maybe we'll need to wait another generation before it happens. But that's the only way that it can happen. Now, we know from experience in South Africa that when you meet today white people in South Africa, everyone, I was there in a visit, and I remember every white person I met said to me, I was against apartheid. So I said, if you were all against apartheid, why did it last for so long? So my feeling is that a lot of Zionists would say, oh, I was never a Zionist and so on, if really we have this regime change. But it's not there. Now, this also connects to your second question. Yes, people demonstrated against the annexation of parts of the West Bank in Tel Aviv, but not all of them, but some of them are doing it because they want to have a pure Jewish state in the rest of historical Palestine. So they still adhere to the idea that to my mind is immoral, dangerous, and would continue to plague the relationship with the Palestinians. This whole idea, because it's very nice that they don't want to incorporate the Palestinians in the West Bank because they want to have a Jewish majority. But it means that they will never respect the Palestinians who are inside Israel as full citizens. And moreover, if you solve only the issue of the part of the West Bank, it's like someone who has a serious disease and you attend to the problem in his hand or one of his limbs. You need to cure the whole body. Not to mention the fact that for me, the basis for any solution is the Palestinian right of return. Without the implementation of the Palestinian right of return, there will never be a genuine reconciliation between Jews and Palestinians. And you cannot implement the right of return in a two-state solution or in a Bantustan in the West Bank. You need to change the whole ideological point of view of the 6-7 million Jews who live in Israel today, to understand that in order to reconcile with the Palestinians, they need to pay a certain price if they want to live a normal life in a democratic state. It's a huge ask. It's a very tall kind of hill that we have to climb, but there's no other option. The only other option is the continued bloodshed, and you know the Israelis have the strongest military in the Middle East and so on. These things can also change. They feel very invincible, but I'm not sure they're right about it. Judging from the history of the Crusaders and apartheid South Africa and so on, they also, for their own benefit, I keep saying to the Israelis, for your own benefit, you still have a partner, the Palestinians, who are willing to reconcile and rebuild life with you on a basis of equality. If you won't accept this offer, you might end up in a way that would first disastrous for the Palestinians, that is true, but will be also disastrous for you.
Thank you very much, Professor ILLANPAPPE, to have with us and give us too much time, far more time than we just expected from you. Thank you from my side. Thank you from the audience that just tune in, and they're just right here. Some are there on the YouTube also, and they have also said thanks to you.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
उमर सही था? हेलो हेलो
हाँ हेलो।
उमर
हाँ
हाँ सही था?
हाँ सही था। क्वेश्चन आंसर तो सही रहे। क्या हो गया उसको, क्या हो गया?
यार 1 मिनट, अब मुझे YouTube पे मुझे बता, एंड स्ट्रीम करूँ ना?
हाँ उधर एंड स्ट्रीम कर दो बस। ओ ये जा रही होगी
Are you
यूट्यूब पे।
sure you want?
यूट्यूब पे जा रही होगी।
Are you sure you want to end
यस
ना?
यस यस।